So Slay the Spire, right? Okay, so this is a game whose visuals I am about to spend a not insignificant amount of time criticizing using words such as underwhelming, kinda scuffed, better than anything I could make, but that's a low bar. So to cushion that, I'm gonna kick off by glazing this thing in ways that will seem entirely redundant to anyone remotely familiar with the title. And if you've followed the indie game scene in any capacity over the past half decade or so, you are absolutely familiar with the title. Either as the incredibly addicting game that robbed you of several weeks of your life, or as the wretched harbinger to the locust swarm of a million, billion, zillion, friggin' William roguelike deck builders that have plagued Steam new releases since 2017. And that kind of resentment doesn't seem entirely unfair at first glance, given the laser precision with which this game was designed and focus tested to sink its hooks in as deeply as possible, with the devs even explicitly discussing in talks and interviews how the game being good for streaming and quote hyper engaging was a priority. And while that sort of sentiment would normally give me kind of sleazy corpo vibes, I give Anthony and Casey a pass for two reasons. One, these are two dudes that had just quit their day jobs to develop a game in the Venn diagram of genres with seemingly no existing audience at the time. And the game industry is completely ruthless on good days. I'm not gonna fault anybody for taking any advantage they can get in that domain. And two, these boys were fucking nice with it, building and refining to a razor's edge an end product considered by players and critics alike to be one of the most well-balanced games ever designed.
A fair price for Slay the Spire is probably like, I'm gonna say
$2,400.
Like, within reason, it's got its sticking points. The intangible condition can be kinda busted, corruption dead branch breaks the game over its knee, the watcher...
Because that's what hell is all about, Robbie. Repetition.
But it's a single-player roguelite, so neither funneling towards the same optimal strat nor subjecting another human being to the trading card equivalent of Chinese water torture are things the devs really needed to worry about too much. Everything from the mechanics to the enemies to the UI design serves to distill the experience into pure, undiluted, quality video game. But you could have the most sublime gameplay systems ever conceived. No one would be likely to give a shit if there wasn't also something visually appealing about it to get them through the door.
Oh, the ward choke slam, then he player to death?
You think anyone would have cared about Yu-Gi-Oh! If they didn't want to rail Hitatsumi Giant? Of course not. Fuck you. Grow up. And it is yet another credit to the game's bulletproof craftsmanship that it became as successful as it did in spite of the Spire and its denizens looking a bit, let's just say the design first nature comes through in the visuals. And before I go any further, I have to make clear that I don't think this game looks bad. And regardless, save for the people that swear by LLM-powered gooning, I am the last person on Earth that gets to act like an authority on art quality or visual fidelity when my ass only recently stopped drawing over 3D model posers with the art I put in these videos. It's still competent at the absolute worst, and does have some genuinely inspired designs, as I'll get into later. But another thing you'll know if you've kept up with the indie game scene in any capacity over the past half decade is that games look fucking phenomenal now. Like legitimately and consistently jaw-dropping, both photorealistic and stylized. A fact that the devs themselves had to contend with in the early days of marketing their game, noting that their kind of underwhelming looking card game would consistently get eaten alive on Screenshot Saturdays.
Like, games are like beautiful now. Everyone's really talented.
That's not to say there's no part of this game that looks conventionally good. The character splash screens and card art, for example, which they clearly contracted professionals for. The problem comes in with the other stuff, namely stuff that takes up most of your screen real estate for the bulk of playtime. For starters, the opening menu, which I do honestly quite like. It gives appropriate scale and foreboding to this unfathomable structure. A pillar that evokes the Tower of Babel both in how it pierces the heavens and how much it fucking hates you. But looking at it a little closer, the cracks are not super well hidden. Fully static background, burning effect on top of a fire PNG instead of actually animating a flame. I'm not particularly knowledgeable about this sort of thing, so the fact that I could intuit how these effects might have been made shows how basic they had to go with them. Hell, I even did the cloud PNG scrolling across the screen myself in a previous video. Again, that doesn't make it bad or low quality, it still works. But it's a sign these guys really had to do a lot with very little here. And there is no better example of this than the character sprites. These little figures, representing you and your opponents, are given some very limited idle animations via Spine 2D. Spine being an animation software that essentially lets you turn 2D assets into rigs that you can then animate with much less labor than hand-drawn would require. That's not to say you can't get dynamic high-energy animation out of Spine or use it to set a certain mood, but that is certainly not what the goal was here. It feels like this was less a means to make them look good than a measure to stop them from looking bad, if that makes any sense. Like, it wasn't so much a vector to show off the personality and energy of all these characters and creatures, though I'm sure that was part of the intent. Some enemies fare better in this regard. But then it was them going, dude, we cannot have the only combat visual be two static PNGs smashing into each other that's gonna look like ass. And speaking of which, yeah, that is the primary combat visual. Just bashing these guys into each other action figure style with a bit of rudimentary VFX on top. They don't even have death animations. They either get opacity reduced to death or just snap into their Yamcha pose on hitting 0. Hell, according to one of the devs,
after I had a character with the right feel, now I had to animate it as well. This was daunting as there was a lot of other work to do. I decided he can just elbow strike the enemy.
which, you know what? Fair. Animation is a thankless job that will drive you insane if you didn't start that way, though that doesn't really explain the back sprites visible at rest spots, which look almost unfinished in their rendering, like there was a final pass that was supposed to happen that just never did. To be fair, the main sprites seem to be rendered in a similar way, but it's way more noticeable when the thing takes up this much of the screen. Then there's the actual character and monster designs themselves, and this is going to be the most subjective part of my gripes, but while I do honestly like the visual direction for these little freaks on the whole, it took me a while to come around on it. On first blush, and for some designs even now, they seem kinda scuffed? Underwhelming? I don't know how best to explain it, but no part of their concept or execution really did much for me starting out. And some I just found kinda questionable. Why is the nimble, dexterity-based rogue character presented as this hunched-over gremlin figure with a blob of a silhouette, for example? And given the devs' self-admitted lack of experience in art and no doubt limited funds available to hire professionals for every part of the art design, none of this is too surprising. But there is one aspect of their design philosophy that elevates what could have been an entirely unappealing and unremarkable visual identity: an abject refusal to be generic. Again, on first blush, that might sound kinda rich, seeing how clearly this draws on your typical fantasy tropes. And granted, this is a game that very much wears its influences on its sleeve. But a central design ethos for their characters and monsters was that they not resemble everything else on the Steam front page. To that end, the goal was slightly different and weird. A slightly different fighter, a slightly different rogue. Not setting the world on fire, but unmistakably Slay the Spire. And the farther up the spire you go, the weirder the designs get. You got the Spheric Guardian, the Orb Walker, the Book of Stabbing, that's its real name. And that stuff always tends to be my favorite. Visually, I mean, fuck this pointy piece of shit. Case in point, my favorite playable character and like 30% of the reason I sunk so much time into this game to begin with. The Defect. I fucking love the Defect, man. What is this even supposed to be? Just a mess of vaguely connected shapes and wires draped in a ratty blue poncho. Even their splash screen description is weird. For every other character, it details their kit in pretty self-explanatory terms. Demonic power, poison, stances. What does the Defect do? The manipulation of orbs. You know, the classic fantasy archetype. Orbs. In essence, they're the mage, what with their elemental powers and like beam attacks.
Fires a beam!
But even that's not clear-cut. Their 4 elements are lightning, ice, darkness, and plasma for one, like Avatar if they plucked Aang out of the Leo cluster. And also, part of their kit is dedicated to tearing enemies limb from limb with their bare hands, complete with a card that lets you give up your mana to slowly turn yourself feral and become a pile of strength and dex buffs like a robo-lycanthrope. Fuck dreaming of electric sheep, bro, we're hunting for them. How do you even conceive of this collection of attributes? How do you give all that shape under the same umbrella? Well, evidently you turn the umbrella into a poncho, because the Defect and their goofy, fushigi ball-ass powers are rad and as iconic to the game as their more conventional counterparts. Which is why when the sequel was announced I was so annoyed that they weren't in the spotlight with the Ironclad and the Silent. Not because I don't expect them to be in the game, the devs have been teasing way too much about that. I'd be shocked if they weren't. But they're part of the main 3! It's like if they remade Pokemon Red and Green for the 17th time and replaced Squirtle with Ghastly as the 3rd starter choice. Like, I like Ghastly, but where the fuck is Squirtle? I don't care if you just pushed it to the Safari Zone, it should be here! But speaking of... sorry, one sec. Card pack. But speaking of the sequel reveal, let's get into that, because that shit was clean. Like, uncharacteristically so for this now franchise. Going from the charming it'll grow on you dinkiness of the original to this gorgeous Netflix animated series looking trailer had a lot of fans, myself included, wondering what that meant for the visuals. Spire 1 did gangbusters, they've got the capital. Are we gonna see a Darkest Dungeon 1-2 style glow up here? Are we gonna see the kind of polish and prestige that not even close. And to be clear, that's not a bad thing. There's only so much you can shine something before you start sanding it down. And from what we've seen so far, this does very much retain the off-kilter aesthetic from the first game with some appreciated improvements. Actual attack and death animations, for example. My guys have frames, you'll love to see it. Plus, a Darkest Dungeon style glow-up risks Darkest Dungeon style unforeseen consequences. Where a game known for its massive and active modding scene sees that community shrink considerably with the increase in fidelity, as the bar for making mods that fit the new aesthetic shoots up into the stratosphere. And look, that may all be cope on my part. I can't with full confidence say I wouldn't be hype if the game looked more like the trailer. But considering my one actual issue with the new art direction, I feel like there's a good chance I'm speaking from the heart here. That issue being the Ironclad. Now, the Ironclad is about as iconic to Slay the Spire as you can possibly get, both in being the first character you play as with the most beginner-friendly kit that nonetheless has a metric assload of build variety, and also in looking kinda fucky. Why is the fighter man that represents the strength stat and attack cards in general so lanky? Why is he stanced up like Uncle Iroh's about to sweep his leg and convince him to abandon his life of crime? Why is the Ironclad wearing mostly leather armor? And of all of Spire 1's questionable designs, this is perhaps the least surprising. Because this is a character the devs themselves admit to seeing as unfinished. Literally, they couldn't quite land on a design for their basic player character and at one point just drew over a sprite of fucking Hakumen from BlazBlue intending to finalize it later. And then the game released and he was still like that. So his new look in the sequel is, on paper, a straight upgrade in almost every way as a character design. He looks huge, for one, so that helps. A lot more visible armor plating. Stance is still a bit wobbly, but not quite as exaggeratedly so. Also helps that the legs making the stance are now wide enough to be mistaken for the Spire's load-bearing pillars. Improvements all around, so what's my beef? Well, it comes back to that original design philosophy of slightly different and weird. Old Ironclad, for all his issues, fit that description to a T. The weird, draconic-looking helmet with the shock of white hair flowing out the back. The massive, unwieldy greatsword stretching out behind him and ending in a weird hook almost like a tail. Even him being so skinny, while almost certainly unintentional, kind of works for him thematically. What little backstory we have for the character is that he made a deal with the devil, sacrificing his tribe for power. So when you see this gangly, literally smoldering corpse man hauling around this massive sword, you think, maybe he's not really the one swinging. In contrast, Ironclad Revelations here, despite being conventionally better designed, is a motherfucker I've seen in other games. Like the platonic ideal of an enemy in a fantasy action platformer that's a huge threat early on but becomes a common mob by late game. All that said, I'm not advocating a return to tradition here, necessarily. I do think the Ironclad should, in fact, look huge. So what would I want to see out of this redesign? Well, in my opinion, prefaced once again by the fact that I am leagues less qualified than the clearly incredibly talented art team at Megacrit, and that this is more an exercise in figuring out how I'd make this design appeal more to me specifically than fixing the new Ironclad, because ugh. I think we can focus on a couple specific elements so as not to completely overhaul what they might have been going for while still getting a bit weird with it. Primarily the sword, we're gonna make it bigger and weirder. And by we, I mean my much more talented friend who I vomited scattered ideas and reference material at until he produced what I think turned out to be a banger of a Hell Knight. His weapon a mobile scrap heap of the swords of his slain tribe, forged and bound together by the flames of his pact. A perpetual reminder of his mistakes that he is forced to literally carry with him for all eternity for the sake of his own survival in the face of the horrors the Spire contains. Now, there are a million different reasons why this design may not work for Slay the Spire 2. Maybe the sword needs to swing quickly now that attack animations are a thing, and that would look weird with this massive heap of iron. Maybe they want to emphasize unarmed combat a bit more with him, as implied by some of the cards we've seen. So the sword needs to look small enough that he could conceivably also backhand a Birdman. Maybe they've changed his lore so the base conceit of this design no longer applies. Maybe it's too busy for the art style. Maybe we lean too far Dark Souls with the execution. Hell, you could even argue a man dragging a big dumb sword across the ground isn't a particularly original design for how much I harped on about that. I don't fucking know. What I do know is that the Ironclad is important to this game. He was there back when it looked like this, and he looked like this. back when the game was still just a product of Anthony Giovanetti's desire to make fucked up decks and TCGs without having to subject another person to being on the other side of it. He is the face of the Spire in all its glory and craftsmanship and flaws and pockmarks. And so I feel like it's really important they get him right. Not perfect, no worthwhile version of this game ever could be, but something unmistakably Slay the Spire. And what we have right now, as competent a design as it is, I just don't think accomplishes what it needs to. But I don't know, I'm a Defect main, maybe I'm just bitter they threw my child in a box. I'm sure the parts of the game that actually matter will be airtight as always. Either way, if anyone at Megacrit is watching, please drop a release date. I'm not the Ironclad, there's only so much more blood I can wring from the stone. And for everyone else, thank you for bearing with my brain rot as I try to get all this out of my system. Especially to my patrons. If you would like to support the noble cause of throwing money in a big fire on the side of the road in front of a homeless person to see the life drain from their eyes just a little bit faster, consider supporting me on Patreon for early access to videos, the ability to vote on video topics, and some other stuff. And see you in the next one.